Today we are joined by Kirk Havens from the US Army Special Forces to VP of Cybersecurity at NIQ. Kirk has seen a lot and turns what he's experienced into really smart and practical advice. And that is why we love talking to Kirk so much. Welcome, Kirk.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here. Excited to get started and hopefully shed some light on some of my experiences.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. Okay, so let's start with the basics. Walk us through kind of your career journey as it's been so far.
In terms of starting from special forces and kind of moving my way up, yeah. So I actually joined the military, prior to 9/11, straight out of high school. Went to college while I was in the military, and then a few years into that journey, had decided that I wanted to do more. Right, I wanted to experience more. I wanted to be challenged more, and that's when I had assessed for special forces, and then spent really the bulk of my career military-wise there up until 2013. And that really afforded me a lot of different experiences, a lot of different exposure. That's where I had my first real, what I would call like technical exposure, and kind of marrying up our mission set with technical capabilities. And so it was interesting because it was taking somebody who, maybe had a more crude set of skills and refining them down and getting taught things that were very hyper technical, and then learning how to leverage them in that entire mission set. It was very eye opening, and it played a major role in my transition later on to the corporate world, where I was able to leverage business education with the military experience, with some of that technical foundation capability and the intelligence work that I was doing, and really kind of parlay that into a role providing cyber intelligence to a Fortune 500 financial institution, which was really different and groundbreaking at that time, because it was not something that people had heard of. It was not a role that many companies had, but it was at the turning point in which cyber attacks became really especially prolific, around the time where TJ Maxx and Target and places like that had just experienced their own major breaches, and they had major exposure. So it was an interesting time from an experience standpoint, and then entry into the civilian sector. So pretty fortunate to have lived through those things.
Yeah. And how do you think your experience in special forces kind of shaped how you assessed risk and threats in the corporate setting?
I don't think that there's really a lot of difference. Really, at the end of the day, it's all about the impact, right? So the difference of the impact is, on one end, you got life, limb, eyesight, nation, state, strategic interests. The other end, you've got strategic interests of the company, assets that are at risk, right? So it's really the same framework and the same formula, just in a bit of a different format in terms of what you're protecting and how you look at the impact of the risk at the end of the day. And in a lot of ways too, that helps you stay grounded, I think, because I see some people will come, even non-military personnel will come into the risk management space within corporate America, and they'll look at things as very catastrophic in nature, and that tendency to catastrophize is closely tied to anxiety, and I think sometimes angst gets caught up in the mix.
Yeah, especially when obviously the work that is done in corporate settings is very important, but normally there's no lives in danger. Like there could be lots of money in danger, but generally no lives. So it wouldn't be a conversation with anyone these days if we didn't talk a little bit about AI and how that's changed the landscape of the work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, it's changed substantially. AI has changed things substantially for us. If you look at it purely, and I'm sure we'll dive into deeper questions, but you look at it purely just from the cybersecurity lens and the threat landscape that exists, you see now AI-enabled attacks through penetration testing tools, penetration testing capabilities, exploitation of vulnerabilities that are out there in the wild, with a mean time to exploit that goes down now into the measured into seconds, right? In some cases, there's exploits being developed and weaponized before they're ever published, right? In much easier fashion. So you see some news recently tied to things like Mythos, if you're familiar with Anthropic and what they're talking about, and the ability to have success in developing exploits in different systems, different software. That creates a whole new set of challenges. But what I like to remind people of is that we're all faced with the same challenge. And so that creates a situation where, now we're forced to change our behavior, which can oftentimes be uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is? Why do you think it's having such a polarizing impact on people? Not just the threat, but even the weaving it into our work. Why is that change, this particular change, so hard for people?
Yeah, it's a good question. What I would say, I'd counter back with a question to you. Is change comfortable?
I mean, but it's consistent. Like, I can't think of a time that we haven't had some big event or something come into play that's impacted business
Right.
or the world, so but the reaction for AI is pretty extreme on
Yeah.
both sides, actually. Like, the people that want to be perceived as very pro AI, like they're all in, like no thought, just all in.
Right.
And then you've got the people who are anti AI, and they won't look at any of the benefits. So I'm like, it's jarring to me that there's so much extreme belief rather than like a measured application of a technology.
I agree. And I think that, again, a lot of it is anchored in not just the change, but I think it's the rate of change, right? And then so you take that rate of change and you match it to some of the hysteria that you hear in the media that's aligned to both sides of like what you just described.
True.
And so then you end up with really what is just people kind of, what I like to define as like tumbling through the sky, just trying to find something to brace themselves against and some reality to anchor against, right? And sometimes, I mean, you even see it where it starts, feuds, like internal disagreements, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about. It's like, okay, well, maybe none of us really know what we're talking about. Right. And like, we need to settle on facts and not be so, dramatic and use all this hyperbole. Right.
Yeah.
I think that there should be some merit given to some of the suggestions that have been made that sound like hyperbole. And there needs to be some consideration for how we bring people along and how we bring companies along and how we bring governments along. When I say governments, I mean, down to local level, public education, you name it, right? I think what is, to borrow from your words, change is constant. And what would be wrong for us to do is to try to ignore this and think this thing goes away, which I think is what, unfortunately, a lot of people prefer. And I understand, I'm actually really sympathetic to it. Like, I understand why people feel that, and I understand why they want that to be the case. But I also worry that they're missing the bigger picture. And by not adopting, it could have, bigger effects than they are anticipating against themselves, their family, children, spouses, etc., friends, you name it, right?
Yeah.
But I think, again, the uncomfortable part about all of this is that it requires a behavioral shift in how you do business and how you live your life on a day-to-day. And so the more that you become acquainted with how these things work and how to leverage them, and you build a level of comfort and your teeth are cut, and it's like, okay, now I can bring some perspective into the equation. So now I understand both sides of the equation, and perspective, I think is always a good antidote to hysteria.
Yes, I would agree. There's a couple of things I just want to double click on that you said that I think are really important. One thing is the misunderstanding of what people are trying to say in conversations. And I think this is because every day there's a new catchy buzzword for something, like whether it's like an agent or whether it's a type of engineer that's you know an AI expert as of 2 weeks ago. There's all these different things. And I think what I recommend to people when you're sitting down and having a conversation about an AI implementation or an idea to have a forward deployed engineer, like what does that even mean? Like let's break down like what we're actually saying. Let's get clear on the definitions of what we're saying, so that we're all understanding each other, because everybody's got their own idea of what they think it is.
Yeah.
And then they come to the table with that, and then there's no curiosity of the other person's understanding. And so
Right.
that's where it gets a little bit tense. And then I think as well, just the enormity of it, like people are doing that to themselves.
Yeah.
Like you don't have to have all of the answers tomorrow.
That's right.
You can take your time to figure out what makes sense for your business, and just rewarding the application is missing the point,
That's right.
because there's people that are building AI processes that take longer than if you just use the original tool. And so what's the benefit? Like, okay, you get to say you're using AI, but what was the goal? Isn't it to just like be efficient and get things done and make progress? And so I personally think there needs to be curiosity as with the passion. And then if you're not passionate about it, like I'm afraid you're going to have to lean in a little bit. Not everybody is comfortable with the idea that jobs could be impacted because you can automate something. But I think that you should only be worried, and this is the last piece, and then I got off my soapbox, but you should only be worried if you have nothing in your head of value. Like
Yeah.
if you've learned nothing in your career, then yeah, probably you're going to get replaced.
Right.
But shouldn't you anyway? Like, you know?
The grift is over. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of. It's like, okay, if you have no original thoughts, or you can't draw on your perspective to give a point of view and direction or make a decision, okay, maybe your role will get impacted.
Sure. Yeah, I think that it's interesting. Like what you're talking about, describing to me is like there's not a lot of critical thinking that goes on when you think about the application of AI in like what it means to you personally, professionally. And that would be like something that I would challenge people to think about. Like I'll give you like a personal example. My own kids, teenage kids, they'll make fun of me at this point. They'll say, "Oh, did you get that from AI, Dad?" And I'll say to them, "You say that like it's a bad thing."
Yeah.
And then that pretty much ends the conversation, right? Because it's like, is it a bad thing? And I'm like, I don't know. Is it? I'm, I'm leveraging something that is tapping into every single available source of information on whatever topic. And I'm inferring like what the next best step might be to tackle the problem. Does that make me bad, good, imperfect? What does it make me? Right?
Yeah.
So you want to label me because of an insecurity, but have you critically thought through this?
Yeah. Like,
right?
Is it humanly possible to retain that amount of data that you can pull? No, that's why we do
not.
Machines.
Right.
I'm curious, and this is a total side question that's just a one thing, but what LLM do you like to use the most?
So I'm partial definitely to using ChatGPT. And that's just because most of that has to do with exposure and what I decided to like teach myself on. Um, but Claude is definitely very good. I leverage it as well. I would say that from an extensibility standpoint, Claude has to be number one. ChatGPT, close follower. Um, it depends. The application of like what you want to do also will drive like what you're using it for. But from a universal standpoint, I think Claude and ChatGPT are the top of the top of the pile.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense.
But that is again, that's very. I just want to be very specific because you could publish this and people will want to sharpshoot this. Like there are niche use cases for many things. But if you're asking me from a like a blanket
Yeah,
perspective,
just for you. Yeah, like
yeah,
what do you like using? Yeah.
that's how I look at it.
And then just to kind of wrap us up on the AI, well, from my perspective, AI and cybersecurity, what do you think is currently being missed or misunderstood about cybersecurity needs in the AI era?
Oh boy. This is a very ambiguous question with probably a very lengthy response that I'll try to truncate. There are a few things. So the best way to think about AI in terms of cybersecurity is it can be an amplifier, both from a productivity and effectiveness standpoint, as well as from an attack perspective, right? So for in the attacker's hands. So an example would be if you're really good at A, B, and C with AI, you're going to be awesome at A, B, and C. If you're not so good at A, B, and C with AI from an attacker's perspective, you're going to get buried underneath A, B, and C. And so really like what that's a signal to do is if you're going to, and there's it's multifaceted, but again, I'm going to make this very simple. If you look at things from the perspective of AI for enablement, enabling the cybersecurity, the team and its defenses versus AI from the attack perspective and what you need to do, from defending against that, what you end up seeing is that you have to be really good from the internal standpoint at the basics, and then you can talk about enabling people with AI. Because back to some of your earlier points, if you don't have very clear ownership and distinct outcomes defined, you are going to spend a lot of time and likely a lot of money and be no better for it, right? And then when you're designing your defenses to protect against existential AI related threats, you have to understand yourself and the existing control plane that you have in your environment and how well that is set up and some of the challenges that you may face as a result of its disposition. And I think that those are really the guiding principles, or should be guiding principles, for cybersecurity teams as a whole.
That makes sense.
I almost think that needs to be the guiding principles for like all applications of like be clear on like what your outcomes are supposed to be. Yeah, I think that's smart.
It is, and I know Aaron has some questions, and I'll refrain from elaborating because I want to be courteous to Aaron. But I think we'll go down that rabbit hole a little bit.
Yeah. I'm curious, and I'm going to go off our sort of preset questions just a little bit, Kirk, because this sort of popped into my mind as you and Amy were talking. But you have really been on the front lines of seeing major changes in the world of work and defense, both with the .com era and in the military, and then now with the entry of AI in the corporate world. And we've talked a little bit about change, but kind of curious from your perspective, and particularly in these large environments, what has to be true in order for a change to be embraced, or something like AI to be deployed and for it to go well?
Oh, so that is the number one thing to define. what has to be true for it to go well. And that is where I think a lot of places are a little bit, or not a little bit, maybe a lot bit wayward. And I think I understand why things are the way that they are. You can see in the last couple of weeks, the CEO of Coca-Cola and the CEO of Walmart both said, "Hey, you know what? We're going to step down. Like, we're not ready to go through this transformation. Like, we've seen enough. We're done." And you know, I actually give them a lot of credit for that. I think that that's a bold statement, very honest, and I think I understand why they arrived at that conclusion. What has to be true is you have to be open-minded and understand. Again, I touched on this already once, maybe twice. You have to be very understanding that this requires a wholesale behavioral shift. And what I mean by behavioral shift is you're going to have to change culture. You're going to have to change systems. You're going to have to change the things that people were comfortable with. Again, change, right? The things that people were comfortable with will no longer look the way that they used to look. And what's difficult, if I talk about it just from the cybersecurity perspective, is if unless you're in a company where you're selling cybersecurity products, you're a support function. You're not what I would characterize as the main effort, right? The main effort is we build the products, we sell the products, we generate the revenue. Very difficult from the support function side of things to generate change, because the main effort is really the main effort, right? And so you need all things to be aligned in a co-equal way in order for it to be seated and function well, right? So that means, like, hey, you have to acknowledge your warts, set aside your differences, and align on a new way of doing things. Which, if you think about that just from an enterprise transformation perspective, forget AI for a minute. That is difficult in and of itself.
Yeah.
Right? Many companies have tried that, and many have failed at that, and many have failed because of trying that. So like that's it. And people are starting to see that. And I can elaborate on that more. But again, I want to be, courteous to you. People are starting to see that, wait a minute, we can't just say, hey, we're going to do AI things. That's starting to become evident now.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's so interesting. Oh, go ahead, Amy.
I was just going to chime in because it just made me think about something that is so obvious, but just like popped into my mind. The bigger the organization is, the almost like they're at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
Like if you're a big company, getting that thing to change is a huge effort.
Correct. And so that is, and I love that I didn't have to say that to you, that you drew that conclusion, because that's more or less I was going down that path. And so there is, this is kind of like a thing as of late that I've had this maybe like an epiphany of where, you start to go down the implementation path, and there are a lot of considerations that have to be had. And what you realize is, like, wait a minute, there's correlation of the size of an organization and the implementation. And so there's actual like parochial knowledge that's tied to this. It's simply systems economics. And then inside of systems economics, it's complexity economics. So when you look at systems economics and complexity economics in contrast to you trying to deploy AI, what you realize is that large organizations can be at a, I say can be, not are, can be at a disadvantage. But my belief is that the longer you wait to do the adoption and you let this play out, if you do it too slowly, that is when you're going to start to see negative impact. And on the flip side, if you do it too quickly without the right guardrails, you're also going to see negative impact. And that is something that a lot of organizations are grappling with right now. So you'll see some stories that'll pop up every now and again where it's like, oh, we implemented AI and we got rid of all these people, but the AI cost us more than the people did. It's like, right. Exactly.
Yeah, that's probably going to happen for a little bit.
Well, what I always tell people though is like, it tends to be, these conversations tend to get emotive like very fast, but I'm more of a fan of disarming and getting back to like the core of the problem, which is, did the AI do that or did we do that?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, the AI wasn't wrong. It did exactly what you wanted it to do.
Right.
And then it's like, oh, right.
But there is going to be, a time period that the human automation mix is in flux. And that the cost up front probably is going to be more than a wage bill.
Yeah.
But again, like that is going to change.
Yes.
I think what concerns me, I mean, because how much money is wasted in corporate America every day, so watching this happen is no surprise. But what I think amazes me is just that like nobody's really clear on like what the goal is, what they want the people experience to be of their organization. It boggles my mind. Like, what's your long-term strategy for your business? Okay, you've got tools and technology, and they have changed exponentially and gotten way smarter. Great.
Yep.
So what's your business goal though? Like, stay focused on that, and then you can work from there in terms of what makes sense from an automation perspective. But don't sit there with like your process that you've had since you started your business and then just think if you buy a tool that you're gonna 10x or 20x your output. Like, that's just not,
especially if it was a bad process. You just 10 times a bad process.
You just get that quicker.
Like,
fail faster.
There's so much conversation about what the workforce will look like, and the aspiration that at least I'm hearing is that teams will become very small, and you'll have this finite number of highly skilled, highly talented people that are then enabled with these AI tools to do what was previously maybe the job of a team of 10. Do you think that's realistic? And yes or no, maybe, and then tell us a little bit more about what you think the best case scenario is for like an integrated sort of AI or agent and human workforce.
Do I think it's realistic? 1,000,000% yes. I actually think that it's the biggest risk to existing organizations, because your ability to now create something from scratch with minimal overhead, minimal debt, with minimal friction, and take market share from existing organizations that do the same thing, that is on now in everybody's hands, right? Like, I'll give you an example, tacitly related. My wife she does this design work on the side, interior design kind of work, kind of a side hustle thing. She loves it. She's great at it. People person. They hire her because they love her. It's great. My son gets this idea that he said, hey, you should build an app, Mom. So, okay, tell me more. I need a paywall. I need this, I need that. And while we were out to dinner one night, he starts fashioning up an app on his iPhone. And he's got a functional app by the next day. Right? So like, think about companies that do similar things, House and things like that, right? Where you can post pictures and do things. He just basically replicated similarities. Now, it's not perfect, right? It's not ready to, make $1 million, but the idea that a 14-year-old kid can spin something like that up while having pizza with his family.
Yeah.
What does House have to think about that? What does Pinterest have to think about this, right? In terms of like what would have to be right for adoption, there's a new concept, and I think it's almost like ahead of its time. There's a new concept in technology that's out there, and I think that it's perfect. It should serve as the anchor point for all business functions. Anything, all your universal services within a company, right? HR, finance, legal, technology. And it's this concept of observability pipeline, right? So if you think about it, AI and agentic AI, and the term agentic agency means like to have agency to make decisions. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, it's basically a person, right? I'm not giving it all like the sentient qualities, but it is a person. So let's think about it in those terms and how we manage it. An observability pipeline is set up with policies, provide standards on how to build something, provide standards on the identity, what it can and can't do, what this person can and can't do, right? It's governed, it's monitored, it's all of those things, just like you would for one of your employees, right? I think if you anchor to that observability pipeline concept and you define in each one of the verticals, the shared service verticals, what is and isn't acceptable, you're going to be leaps and bounds ahead of where anybody else is. Because that right now, this is industry wide. What I see is you see a lot of people that are like getting these, they're getting these mandates, do something, right? A lot of that is pressure from investors, pressure from the market because, hey, this buzzword means, N% increase in value, right? And then unfortunately, a lot of employees hear it and it's like, they said do something, so we're going to do something. And then they go and do something not realizing, hey, there's really not a lot of value to this, or, hey, you just exposed us to a lot of risk by doing this, and then it runs until it doesn't anymore. Yeah. And that's where I think a lot of companies are starting to, like the checks coming due now, a lot of companies, and they're starting to see these tabs and it's like, wait a minute, we didn't count on that. We thought we turned this on and we're going to get value out of it. And that's just not been the case over and over again. Again, that's not AI's fault.
It's the application. I wonder as well if we'll start to see a rise in people thinking about governance or even ethical application, or not that ethical in terms of like the big picture of wiping out jobs, ethical in terms of being transparent when it is AI that's generated the work, or being mindful of where a human interacts with your product and what the best solution for potential challenges might be, and where risk could heighten. I wonder if we'll start to see a rise in like jobs that would help with that, or if the expectation is going to be that that's what your C-level does. They govern the application. But I don't know if that's the right fit. What do you think?
I think you're starting to touch in the complexity economic side of the equation. This gets really complicated really fast. So what you're describing is you need an agent to watch the agents, which is a real thing, by the way. It's a real recommendation, a real application. But like the more you layer that complexity on, the more costly things become, right? And so that's a very difficult problem to solve. From an ethical use standpoint, that is where there's ethical use by the user within the constraints of a model, and then there's ethical model, and is the model itself ethical, right? So certainly you've seen some of these things that have gone around where it's like, well, I'm going to ask 4 different models, 4 different questions, and you're going to get 4 different results. Or you might get 2 or 3 that are similar and one is just radically different, right? So what is the source of truth? But these are questions like that, those are regulatory oversight questions that need to be asked at a much higher level.
Yeah. When do you think that will happen?
When?
Yeah. How quick do you think they'll get to us? But like, is everybody just kind of sat watching, waiting to see what could go wrong? Like what?
It's weird because I think from the governing and regulatory oversight through government sense of things, I think what we're likely to see is glacial change. But the reality is, like, internally, the Department of Defense, they're, intelligence community, they want to leverage this stuff and are leveraging this stuff as fast as humanly possible. But it is in the same way that businesses do, because it is powerful and it is very useful. However, unchecked, like you start to have, or you should, I think we should question, where does the concentration of power start to sit? And now it's concentrated truly within these companies that are the frontier models. And it's like, hey, who's really driving what happens next here? Like, who are the real power brokers? And then who's watching them and who's watching what goes on there?
I mean, the challenges as well is that, you've got the companies that are creating the technology that will benefit from it being widely adopted, and they're taking charge of the narrative in a lot of ways. But it's not like our government is set up to deal with this kind of problem. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that they were interviewing Mark Zuckerberg and they didn't even know how Facebook Messenger worked. So how can you expect these people to come up with a regulatory philosophy on something they probably don't understand?
Right. And I would say, in addition to that, it's not an accident that the folks that are responsible for these frontier models are also volunteering to help draft regulatory oversight frameworks.
Yeah.
Right? There's some value in being part of the solution here.
Yeah.
And
but who else? Where, sorry, I'm just like, where else would you go though? If you don't go to, your tech leaders, you can't ask your government. Where do you go?
Yeah, I mean, so these are the hard questions. So this is where I think people, and I think it's actually healthy to kind of go down this path so long as you stay grounded. But this is where you start to get down these paths of like 80% unemployment. Everybody's losing a job. Everything's going to be free. Like universal basic income for all, universal high basic income for all. Like all of these concepts start, coming out. This is another one. Like I've brought this up many a time. Like how will we govern inside of a country where you have the problems that you just, so eloquently laid out, and in a situation where the application of AI, if you look at it from let's just look at it from a nation state to nation state conversation. AI creates a situation where a small organization, or a small country rather, a small nation state, can have a disproportionate impact now because of their application of AI, their application of asymmetric intelligence gathering and asymmetric warfare associated with AI. Now, a country that is a fraction of the size can project a tremendous amount more power than they previously could, right? So now you're talking about difficulties in governing, not just from a defense side of things, but how do you govern the defense side, also the economic side of what's going on inside of your own country, when you have a very high concentration of power centered in a handful of companies that are effectively dictating, what will unfold and how things will unfold, and in many cases at what pace it'll unfold. But what you end up seeing is what I think, if you believe anything that that Elon Musk says, you end up in like the singularity conversation, which is you can't really see over the horizon of like what's next. Now you can iterate through, but I always try to, and I think there's truth to that. I try to ground myself in reality though, and say like, okay, We're worried about 80% unemployment. Have we ever considered what 40% unemployment looks like? It's like, wow, like, right. Okay. So if, the bank forecloses on your home and they foreclose on everybody else's home, does the bank exist? Oh, and it's like, yeah, we never make it to 80%. Okay, well, who's responsible for, solving for that problem? I don't know. Universal basic high income? I don't know. Right? So my grounding in that is to really say, hey, you know what? I am choosing to be aware of what's happening and how to leverage these things and how to apply them to be beneficial, what the harm could be in using them for nefarious purposes, and trying to make sure that I'm living in a way where I'm prepared and not necessarily caught off guard, right?
Yeah.
So I'm embracing the change, but I'm also aware of the ups, the downs, and whatnot associated with it.
Yeah. More change is on the horizon. Yeah. Totally.
I think that's, if there's one really key takeaway, I know we're going to transition into some takeaways in a moment here, but that feels like it to me. I was reading an article that SHRM put out yesterday that talked about the disparity by company size with respect to AI strategy and AI deployments. And, no surprise, right? Like the ones who are doing it are the big companies, and then the small segment of small companies who are tech startups. Mm-hmm. And in between, they surveyed this population of smaller and mid-market companies to say what's getting in the way, and the answer is we just don't know where to start. Mm-hmm. And so I think the guidance that you just shared, Kirk, around you have to start, you have to sort of inventory what you know to be true and start to make kind of one foot in front of the other steps towards transforming your business before it's obsolete. That's where people start. And I think it's, it's a great message of, maybe instead of thinking 100 steps ahead all the time and just being consumed by that, how do you start to make measured baby steps in the right direction, or at least in the direction that you feel is right, knowing what we know today?
Agree. 100% agree. Yeah. It's fun to go down that rabbit hole and, theorize behind or what's going to happen. But again, that's where I think that's where a lot of, at the outset of the conversation, Amy, what you described, I think that's where a lot of that angst comes in, though, between people. I think this, or I think that. I'm not touching this. I'm not touching that. I'm going to do it this way. It's like, okay.
I mean, the reality is, though, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. There's no stopping it. So
that would be the worst mistake at this point, and I have people tell me frequently, speaking to the government, I have people tell me frequently, well, we'll regulate it. We'll stop it. And it's like, no, the government knows that's not possible, right? Like we're in a literal arms race with near peer nation states. Like they're not stopping. There's no way. We can't afford to stop. Like our economy now is way too dependent on it now. Right? Yeah. So stopping is not an option. So people should really flush that from their vocabulary. I worry more if you want to talk about concern, there's going to be this bridge time for what is it, Gen Z, I guess you would say. Like there's going to be a bridge time where it's like you're educated in a time where it was still very public school. You went to school, you got the books, you learned, reading, writing, arithmetic. Like I think that is going to be so antiquated in the next 10 years that the kids that were learning what they learned in their first, 5-10 years of school would be semi-obsolete. Now, not entirely, because I think that crystallized intelligence is very important, and it makes you a better operator utilizing AI. 100% believe that. But I think the delivery method for education is going to be the hardest shift, but it's going to be monumental, I think.
I mean, some would say it needs something because it's not like the US have a great reputation in the world for having a solid education for under 18s, and then college is very determined on your financial situation, on what type of education that you get. So it's kind
Yeah.
of crazy, but that's not true anymore necessarily. It's funny, I was just having this conversation the other day because I was with a client and we were looking at profiles on LinkedIn, and instantly they were like scrolling down to the education, and I'm like, that is so irrelevant to
Sure.
like this person. What you want this person to do like didn't exist when they were in school, so what does it matter?
Right.
What does it matter? Like,
Yeah,
what could they possibly
you're hiring for aptitude.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's a big shift for some people. It's like, forget, how you used to assess a resume. Now you're going to have to talk to the person
Yeah.
and understand how curious they are, how they think through a problem, what their appetite is for learning. And that, people haven't had to assess people like that before. It's been like, well, I've done this job for 10 years in different companies, so of course they're going to be good here. And let's just, make the hire. And plus, I know a few people that went to that school and they're super smart, so I think we'll be fine. It's just not relevant.
Yeah.
It's totally different now. The people that you want are probably like hanging out, building crazy things on their own with no education. Like they're just
It's entirely
curious.
possible. Yeah. I mean, that, that is that is one of the other like points of consternation, is like, what does the education even look like? Like, what's the relevance of going to college?
Yeah.
A lot of people are starting to ask that. A lot of parents, I hear, are even starting to ask that question. It's like, what are you going to teach them that they can't otherwise learn themselves?
Right. But then there's a real gap in communication and just the basics of being a human on earth that
Yeah.
people struggle. The longer you spend in education, I think the harder you find life. It's just,
Well, you're taking I mean, it's like it's the name academia, right? Like taking a very academic approach to a practical issue. You can sit there and hypothesize and teach to like how to tackle a problem, but then
what
ask
are
the
you
person
going
like,
to
okay,
do?
well, how many times have you faced that problem? I've never actually faced the problem.
But I've
Oh,
thought about it a lot.
okay. Thanks.
Yeah, because when you're in the hot seat, it changes. Everything
Yeah, of
changes.
course. There's another. I thought you were going to go a slightly different direction. There is there's a shift there. This is not like the catastrophizing sense, like side of things, but there is a shift that I see happening, and my wife actually sees it happening too in her line of work, in the mental health profession. There is a shift where that communication. So I would first, just to put on the table, 100% agree. Being able to communicate effectively is important, but its relevance to like business and what you do as a job, I think, is going to become potentially less important. And I'll qualify that. I know that'll sound challenging to some. I don't think that's a universal like an absolute. By the way, I just think in many cases, because the more that we leverage AI, the more it depersonalizes things. And so what you see now is, and I even find myself doing this to a degree, what you see now is you'll see people, they will have very personal relationships with the AI that they're using.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's, in some cases it gets unhealthy. But you see the establishment of like a real relationship with some of these things.
Yeah.
And you can, if you're using the tools long enough, like you could recognize why. But I think it's dangerous in the sense that if your input into that mechanism has a dramatic impact on what the output is.
Mm-hmm.
So you end up in this
Like an echo chamber of
self-fulfilling
your own.
prophecy. Yes. You know, so you have
Yeah.
to be very careful about like what you're doing and how you treat that. But I can see already how it's depersonalized a lot of engagements. But I think that, you know, if you're talking about the level of efficiency that I think can be brought to bear, that may be one of your greatest touch points. I mean, truly.
Crazy. It's crazy. Are we ready to do the wrap?
Let's do it.
Okay. What is one company type that is most at risk right now?
One company type most at risk. So the consulting firms, I think, are majorly at risk, and they are definitely scrambling to change their business models to find ways to integrate AI.
Mm-hmm.
You hear a lot about SaaS companies, and there's some back and forth. I'll tell you that there is truth, a lot of truth to the SaaS companies being at risk. Excuse me. To give the description earlier about what my son had done, you know, that in and of itself is an example of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you like, there's a fun website that's out there. It's called Death by Claude. You can enter the domain that you're interested in the company, and it'll give you some rather hilarious information about said company and whether or not it's at risk. I mean, it's definitely directionally correct. You know, it's a bit satirical, but it's accurate. So yeah, the SaaS companies that were providing seat level licensing services, those companies are very, very, very much at risk. And then I would say the other companies at risk are the ones that are highly complex and diffuse, are going to be at risk of market share erosion. So I don't look at it as like, hey, you're going to come and be unseated by somebody that designs a thing that displaces you entirely. I think it's more likely, hey, somebody's going to displace 10% of what you do. Are you ready to lose 10%?
Yeah, no. And that kind of leads me to the next question. What do you think one economic shift is taking place that leaders are underestimating?
An economic shift in terms of AI?
Mm-hmm.
I think that I don't know if this will answer your question directly. The biggest underestimation, I think, at this point is the lack of financial controls within the deployment of these solutions and the impact that will have on them economically, on the companies economically over the next, we'll call it next year. Because I think we're in very early innings of companies that have adopted, right? So you can have like your JP Morgans, I forget how many, it was a 9-figure sum of money that they invested into AI. And, there's AI we built it into our products, and then that carries its own problems. Then there's AI that we're providing to employees, right? Mm-hmm. But without the proper financial controls, this has the potential to be, catastrophic for some organizations. But whereas for a company like JP Morgan that's printing money, probably less impactful, right? Maybe a rounding error for them. But the unchecked rollouts and deployments of these solutions, and then if we talk about in terms of economics, what I think will be required in terms of reeling that back in. Look, you only have so many OpEx levers to pull. Like you can either make more money, you can reduce OpEx. Like those are kind of your choices, right?
Yeah.
And then the downstream impact is like, okay, well, what does that do to these existing AI companies and so forth, right?
Yeah, makes sense. And then what is one move that you recommend people make to be more secure with their AI strategy?
Personal or company wide?
Either.
I'm gonna take the company approach here. Before you roll out AI in your organization, have a very defined plan as to what you want to accomplish. That observability pipeline is key. If you work down that theory, that methodology, your application of AI is not going to just be more secure. It's also going to be financially more responsible. Mm-hmm. The biggest flaw that I see time and time again, and you hear about this all over Twitter, this company had this agent do this thing. The biggest flaw I see is everybody's very quick to roll these things out, absent any of that observability piece. They don't even understand what that agent, right, this virtual human, like I described earlier, is doing inside of their own environment. That's the biggest issue that I see.
Yeah, makes sense. Last question, totally off topic. How long were you in the military?
Almost 14 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
How was the training? Were you pretty fit before you went in?
Is this going to be recorded, or are we going to?
Yeah, of course.
We're going to include this.
Was it pretty strenuous?
Of course, yes, as you would expect.
Walls with no footholds.
I mean, I've definitely done that. Yes.
Shimmying through the nets.
Of course, yeah. Before, so it was something I was always interested in.
Because you're patriotic, or because you just thought it was an interesting.
I think a little of both. Like I just had a level of respect for people in the military. I was fascinated with military things. I don't really know, like, I can't point to like one thing and say, hey, that was it, right?
That was the moment.
That was the moment. Yeah, it wasn't really like that. But there's a lot of misnomers too. There's a lot of things that people, they have these perspectives, and like I don't fault anybody, because in the US especially, the US is so big and broad that it's extremely uncommon to live near a military installation. Like unless you live near a military installation, it's you can ask
everywhere in England. You can't like turn a corner without bumping into a barracks.
Right, exactly. So it's very different, right? So you see, and you're kind of familiar with these things, So people will ask like really funny things like, hey, did you live in a tent? I'm like, well, not usually. I mean, a house, family, the dinner table, But like, I understand why they ask these questions, because like they don't know, right? Yeah. And it's like, no, I lived a fairly. People will be like, are you crazy? I lived a fairly normal life, outside of
in the military.
what my job was, Yeah.
Like
my day-to-day life was, I went to work, did my job, I came home. Like, unless I was training or deployed, like that was my life. But yeah, I mean, the training is like anything else in the military. I tell people it's what you make of it. And so, I chose a really difficult path. A lot of people before me had made it. A lot of people after me have made it. It's not impossible. I don't let that define me, who I am. That was an identity at a point in time. Something that I'm very, very grateful for. The experience is really unmatched. I think sometimes to myself, like, I'd go back today if I could. I definitely miss that side of things. But yeah, all in all, yes, strenuous, difficult, everything that you can imagine, every emotion that you can experience, definitely felt, for sure.
Wow. Appreciate that you did that for your country, because if people didn't, I don't know where we would be.
I appreciate the thoughts and the sentiment. I hear that a lot from people, where people will say things like, hey, I'm not gonna, not my child, not my kid. And, I say, well, if not them, then who? Like, who's going to do it? Like, that's the question I think people need to ask themselves. It's not for, and by no means am I saying it's not for everybody either, right? But there's, this will sound like I'm talking out both sides of my mouth. It's not for everybody, but I don't I don't really know anybody that is like purpose built to go do what I did. Like you have a desire and a passion, but you're trained to that
It's
level.
the relentless work that goes along with being in the military.
Yes. Like there's no like one size fits all.
No.
And you'll hear a lot of stories from folks in the special operations community and, talk about the selection process. I was an instructor for a handful of years. You'll talk about the selection process and you'll look at people, and it would be really easy to look at guys that are just look like physical specimens. And there are a lot of guys that end up, becoming that, but you would look at those guys in the assessment selection process and say, oh yeah, that'd be the person that's going to make it. Almost never. And what you really realize is that the whole thing, where there's a ton of physical strenuous tests, the whole thing is really a mental evaluation.
Yeah. How strong are you mentally to go through something and keep going, even when it feels horrific?
Well, and how you're navigating like some very complex challenges that are put in front of you. And you're constantly being evaluated psychologically, constantly.
Oh, I wouldn't last 5 minutes.
I think you might.
You might.
No way. Number one, I don't crawl. Number two, I haven't had a good bill of mental health since 1986.
The physical part would be hard for me. I'm too old at this point, I think. A lot of gym days to prepare for.
Not even on my best day could I do that.
Well, it's like my one of my son's teammates, the father, he asked me last summer, when the tensions with Iran had first kicked off, he's like, hey, could you go back and be on a team right now? I'm like, are you crazy? Like, have you lost your mind? I'm like, they would leave me for dead. I would be a liability to them immediately. They're like, he was shocked. He's like, but you look really fit. I'm like, it's different. It is at a level that you can't really appreciate unless you've been there.
Yeah.
And it's, and I have a tremendous amount of respect, and like, that's the standard that I expect that they continue to uphold in those organizations. But there's just walking, you're not doing that in your mid-40s. It's not happening.
That's why you got to promote. If you're going to stay in, you got to promote.
Oh, yeah.
Not behind a desk, not out there doing the crazy shenanigans.
Well, ultimately, that's why I decided to retire when I did. So I was injured pretty bad in 2013. And, I spent a number of months in and out of the hospital. And, it was really like, okay, well, you're not going to be operational anymore. And for me, it was like, I've been promoted already there was only really one more level I could go up, and I didn't want to sit behind a desk the rest of my career. It felt like, it didn't feel like I was doing what I was supposed to do, so it was time for me to kind of like pack it up and make the journey into the civilian sector. So.
Well, I'm glad that you did. Then I got to meet you. Been brightening up my world since 2017.
It's been that long.
Yeah. Well, good to chat with you, Kirk. Thanks so much for your time.
Same here. Thank you. Take care.
Have a good day. Bye.
Bye-bye.